Welcome, everyone, to the Ontario Caregiver Organization's webinar series. These webinars bring together caregivers and subject matter experts to explore topics of interest to caregivers. We do this to support and engage chosen family, friends, and neighbors who are caring for someone. I'm Roxane Dion-Boudreau, and I will be your moderator for today. We begin this gathering by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform with people joining us from across the province, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we all call home. The land I am standing on today is the traditional territory of the Algonquins and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. Today's gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. As team members, we are learning about the lands from which we work, exploring how we can be meaningful allies and how we can support the recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We do this to affirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their culture. We invite you to take a moment to reflect on the land where you are. And if you're not familiar with that, we will be sharing an interactive map that tells you which traditional territory your city or town sits on. So our webinar today is called The Importance of Cultural Competence, the Caregiver Connection. Relationships with healthcare providers are an important part of the caregiving role, but it is often difficult to connect with people when we do not understand their culture or background. Cultural competency is knowledge and behavior that enables caregivers and healthcare providers to interact respectfully in a manner that is mindful, open, and sensitive to differences we may not be familiar with. Today, we will learn more about cultural competency in healthcare settings and understand why this is so important. We'll explore the ways in which we see and respond to differences and how it impacts our interactions with those around us. We'll examine barriers in healthcare that relate to the caregiving space and share some takeaway tips and strategies to foster culturally competent relationships in healthcare settings. So joining us today to share more about cultural competency is Usha Shumagatison and Munira Kiljili. Of course, I was gonna mess this up. So Usha is a daughter, caregiver, teacher, and recently became a single mom by choice through IVF, resulting in a little girl who is fondly called Squishy. She's a graduate of the University of Toronto, receiving an honors Bachelor of Arts with high distinction in the areas of women and gender studies and equity studies. She received her Bachelor of Education from Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto the following year and has worked as a teacher for the last 17 years in the public, independent, and not-for-profit sectors. Usha is a passionate advocate for social justice, which led her to the South Asian Autism Awareness Center, where she was the project co-lead for the Cultural Competence Toolkits. She is also a speaker and trainer, designing and facilitating professional development for educators across Canada and the US. More recently, she has been collaborating on cultural competence training for allied health professionals in the autism space. Usha recently obtained her master's degree in educational leadership and policy and is a 2021 Arbor Award recipient for Outstanding Volunteer Series to the University of Toronto. Her training as a physician, experience as a parent navigating developmental, medical, and learning needs for her children, and commitment to health equity in understanding communities brings Munira before us today. For more than a decade now, she has championed the need for better support and services for families of children on the autism spectrum in structurally marginalized neighborhoods. She started off with the community-led Thorncliffe Collaborative for Muslim Families that enabled parents to engage in learning opportunities that were accessible and culturally sensitive. She then gathered experience in cross-sectorial partnerships and integrated healthcare pathways through her work coordinating a school-based pediatric clinic that focuses on supporting children who experience challenges with learning, behavior, and development. Currently, Monira's portfolio at the SAAAC Autism Center includes the Entry to School program and community outreach. The SAAAC Autism Center is a Scarborough-based charity that aims to make autism services equitable for all Canadians by providing culturally responsive services to structurally marginalized communities. So welcome so much, Usha and Monira, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you so much for those lovely introductions. We're really looking forward to spending time with you today and sharing sort of our knowledges and information, and hopefully we leave feeling a little bit more confident in the spaces that we go in. In addition to all the things that we do professionally, personally, Monira and myself are both caregivers as well, just like many of you. I'm a caregiver to a senior parent. My mom is 78 years old. I say that very proudly. And I've been caregiving since I was about 12 years old. We are refugees to this country and have gone through a very sort of complex settling process here, navigating health barriers and financial barriers. My father passed away when I was 12 years old. And, you know, I am both a daughter and a caregiver, and as in my bio, recently became a single mom by choice. And so I fondly tell everybody that now I am the middle child in our home. My mom's the eldest and the coolest, and my baby gets all the attention. So I just kind of caregive in the middle. Monira?
Hello, everyone. We're so glad you're joining us today. In addition to everything that Rox had just explained, I'm also a caregiver to two teenagers. Both of my children have had neurodevelopmental challenges. And so between the two, we navigate autism, ADHD, and learning disabilities, as well as one of them had very severe medical needs in the first 3-4 years of her life. So coming from a caregiver lens, completely understand what it looks like to have priorities drastically shift and what that can mean for our trajectories in terms of career and personal and professional development. In addition to both my kids, also I have should I say, a on and off caregiver to elderly parents, one of whom is currently battling breast cancer, my mother, as well as my sister. Both of them, they got diagnosed at about almost exactly the same time. So the caregiving on and off through that space is a current challenge. So yeah, thank you for joining us. The other thing that I would like to say is I like to call myself a first and second generation immigrant. I grew up in Ottawa, but I had moved back to Pakistan and proudly have called it home for a very long time. And then I moved back to Canada during my adult life. And sometimes it felt like I had never been here before, and other times it felt like I had always been here. So, but mostly it's the former, not the latter. So moving on to our presentation today, some of the learning goals that we'll be talking about. We'll be learning a little bit about cultural competency in healthcare settings, understanding why that's important. We'll explore the ways in which we see how we interact with our environment and how it impacts our interactions with those around us, how we interact with the differences in our spaces. We'll take a deeper look at barriers in healthcare that relate to the caregiving space. And finally, we'll have some tips and strategies to look at how to foster culturally competent relationships in healthcare settings. And also, the slide deck will be provided to you at the end.
And in addition to the information that we're going to be sharing with you today, we do acknowledge that it might bring up various emotions. And so we welcome you to take note of those emotions, to where you are feeling them in your mind and your body and your spirit. Maybe reflect on why these emotions are coming to the surface. And that they may be, you may experience discomfort, maybe some of it might be uncomfortable. Growth happens through discomfort, but at the same time, we also want you to prioritize your self-care. So please do take care of you during this webinar. So in order to begin sort of our journey into understanding cultural competence, we want to take a moment to sort of position our identities. So what is it that we're talking about when we talk about social identity? What we're really speaking to is an individual sense of who they are, which are based on social groups that they are either placed into or that they ascribe to. So social identity allows individuals to have a sense of belonging. And sometimes social identities also cause, not the social identity itself, but the narrative that's associated to that social identity results in exclusion and marginalization. So social identities, as you can see here, some of them are race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, religion, age, gender, sex, sexual orientation, national origin, first language, physical, emotional, developmental ability, disability. These are some of the social categories, but obviously not all the social categories amongst which people fall into. The thing that we want to remember, as I said before, is that often with these social identities, they are either ascribed to us or we ascribe to them. And some social identities, depending on the space that you're in, carry with it a little bit more power and a little bit more privilege than maybe other social identities do. So what do I mean by that? So power, in the sense that you have the ability to influence and make decisions impact others. And privilege is the advantages and the benefits that individuals receive because their social groups are perceived to be part of sort of the dominant narrative, the dominant discourse. And privilege is often a result of systemic targeting or marginalization of another social group. So what we're basically saying is that identity shapes your experiences. It makes your experience unique, even when they are in the same setting as someone else. So when you walk into a setting, like a healthcare setting as a caregiver, for example, your identities are coming into that space with you. So a caregiver from a low socioeconomic background who is gay, for example, would have a very significantly different experience from a caregiver who may be white and straight. So often these social identities are something important that we want to acknowledge and examine. And identities themselves do not operate within a silo. So our identities intersect with each other. And so we're going to watch a little video on intersectionality just so that we can illustrate what that means.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality refers to the way race, gender, class, sexuality, and other parts of who we are overlap with one another. People from different backgrounds experience the world differently. Intersectionality helps explain how parts of who we are come together to determine who has power in our society and who does not. People are complex, and many factors contribute to our identities and experiences. We cannot look only at one part of our humanity. We have to look at the whole picture and all the factors that impact our identity and experience in society.
We've talked about multiple identities and how the intersectionality of those identities determine how we're positioned in the balance of privilege and oppression. Our identities, the experiences that we have because of them, the people we interact with, all of these constantly shape the biases that we hold as well. So understanding and addressing our biases is a critical first step in fostering inclusivity and equality. And while we might actively work to overcome conscious biases like overt racism, it's the unconscious biases that pose a greater challenge. And the reason for this is that these biases, they operate beyond our awareness and control, which makes it really hard to access or even acknowledge that it's there. And because of this unconscious biases, they often influence our actions more significantly than conscious biases and are quite pervasive in our society. It's important to recognize that, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm a caregiver myself, it can be very stressful. And it's essential to recognize that stressful situations can trigger these biases, impacting our decisions and our interactions without us really being consciously aware that it's happening. And so acknowledging both the existence of conscious and unconscious biases is pivotal in creating a more equitable and understanding environment for everyone in our caregiving spaces. And so it's important to really think about, how are the biases that we hold, how do they impact us as caregivers? How do they impact how we fulfill our responsibilities in that role? So, for example, as a caregiver, who are you most comfortable interacting with? Who are you not as comfortable interacting with? And why is that? And with that, we have another video for you. One moment.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
Everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
Pretty.
Can I touch it, please? Can I please?
is annoying and makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
So we were quite intentional with choosing this video. And first of all, I'll get into what microaggressions are and sort of, why we're putting this in this presentation. The analogy to the mosquito bite is not in any way intended to diminish the intensity and the severity that microaggressions have on mental health, physical well-being, opportunities in life. It's quite heavily documented. Microaggressions first came into sort of the canon by Dr. Chester Pierce, who's a Black American psychiatrist. And it was his way of sort of documenting and understanding what was happening to Black Americans in the States, I believe around in the 70s. His research is quite interesting. And, he was talking about it's those kind of everyday subtle occurrences that you're almost like, did that just happen? Did they actually just say that to me? That leaves you in like perpetual confusion. And years of experiencing that leads to a lot of detrimental mental health and physical health outcomes. And so Dr. Daryl Wingsu then added on to Dr. Chester Pierce's research by looking at other social identities and microaggressions that are ever present in them. So microaggressions essentially is a term that is used to for commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental slights, whether they are intentional or unintentional. But basically, they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative attitudes towards stigmatized or culturally marginalized or historically excluded groups. So when we say microaggression, we're not talking about the impact of the said aggression. The microaggression is talking about the setting that it's taking place in, the everyday, right? That it's happening between individuals versus a system or a policy that's having this outcome on someone. And, as someone who is racialized, that identity often walks into spaces long before I do. And as a racialized caregiver, I've really had to navigate, in healthcare settings for, care for my mom, for, tests, for diagnoses, for her to be actually believed. One of my mom's conditions is chronic pain due to underlying conditions. And it was a decade and many missed opportunities for early intervention that led to sort of her having this physical disability. And because I was caregiving so young, listening to a 12, 13, 14-year-old try to advocate for her mother is not something that the healthcare setting, sort of did. And unfortunately, because of those social identities and not being listened to and not being believed had detrimental consequences for my mother. Now, I'm able to use, my age, my education, my privilege in being an English speaker, lean into the power of those identities to compensate for identities of being a woman, of being a woman of color, of moving from a low socioeconomic background to a more middle-class background. So shift in social identities have helped me advocate better for my own parent, but we know that's not the case for all of our caregivers. Munira?
From what you've mentioned, Usha, it actually reminds me, I was working in a clinic as was mentioned before. I am a trained physician who can't practice in Canada due to other systemic barriers. But I was working in a clinic supporting a family physician. And while I was interacting with a patient, she asked me my name. And I stated my full name. And I said, my name's Munira Khilji. And she repeated back to me and she says, Khilji? I wouldn't want to have you as my doctor with a name like that. And honestly, as I say this to you all now, it takes me right back. That day was so many years ago, but I had never heard my name said that way. And for me, my name, it's a part of my identity. It was chosen for me. It has deep meaning. And for my name to be mispronounced and then my identity to be linked to such a horrible word was really awful. Like for me, like this happened more than 10 years ago, and that incident has been seared into my memory because the name, when your name is taken or when you are interacting with someone, saying their name, that's the very first interaction that you have with the person. And so it's it's that first opportunity to respect and honor the person in front of you is by saying their name. And so even if it might be a name that is different, that is not familiar to us, it's different. It doesn't mean it's any less. And it honestly, it shouldn't be demeaned. And yeah, it is, to be honest, even now it's difficult to talk about because it's my name.
So, we talked about sort of positioning our social identities. We can see how the narratives that we've been told, that we've heard, that we've experienced about social groups, have sort of formed biases that we have. And how biases can often act out in these sort of microaggressions, whether intentional or unintentional. So everything is kind of connected. And so does that mean that it's hopeless? No, of course not, right? It's when we know better, we can do better. And so cultural competence is a framework that we often ground our work in. At SAC, I know as an educator myself, I use this work quite a bit, and in our personal lives. So now, arming ourselves with kind of information helps us sort of navigate in those often unpredictable terrains that we're going into, especially, when we're going into things like healthcare settings, there is a sort of power dynamic, right? And I know that as a South Asian woman, for example, we defer to authority, not as like an overarching thing, but a lot of us that are grew up in this culture often say, okay, well, if the doctor said, the doctor said, you take that as the word, right? So when we're talking about cultural competence and this continuum, exactly what does that mean? So when we say cultural competence, we're really talking about this sort of congruent, a set of like behaviors, attitudes and policies that sort of come together, either in a system, an agency, or at a professional individual level. And these congruent sets of behaviors, attitudes, and policies basically enable that system, that agency, that individual to work effectively within cross-cultural situations. So culture is often used to describe kind of that interconnected pattern of human behavior. So that includes thought, communication, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions of a racial, ethnic, religious, or social group. So go back to the social groups and social identities we talked about in the beginning. So why competence? Somebody had once said to me, competence implies that there's incompetence. And so, well, yes, let's talk about that. We use competence because, it implies that you can have the capacity to sort of function and navigate systems effectively as a system, an organization, or as an individual. And that incompetence, rarely, we don't see it as much, but incompetence sort of belies either an unwillingness to learn and to grow, or often implies, just kind of getting there and doing something that we don't want to happen, and that we can unlearn sort of those behaviors and replace them with a new set of behaviors. And when you look at this continuum specifically, it's presented linearly, but we know that nothing in life is linear. In some cases, you can behave in a way that was very culturally, competent, do all the right things, and in another space, there was incapacity there, right? So it's kind of an intermix. Think of it more like as a wheel, and we're always learning and trying to shift towards more of that competence. And the journey is never done. I don't know that we can ever say that we're proficient, right? I think we can say we're always leaning towards that. We're always trying to engage there. And within the cultural competence continuum as well, we want to take into account, as we talk about biases and microaggressions, that some of the terms are a little bit outdated, that need to be more culturally competent themselves. So for example, cultural blindness, using a term that's talking about, a social group, people something to belong to, and to describe that as a more deficit. So it's not a perfect continuum, it's not a perfect framework, but it is a framework that is, helping us on our journey. So the first part of the continuum that we're presenting is cultural destructiveness. So when we talk about cultural destructiveness, what we're really talking about is basically what the term is saying. So the catch-all phrase would be, you see the difference and you're trying to stomp out the difference. So when we think about cultural destructiveness, we're thinking about behaviors, attitudes, policies that are destructive to a culture and its members, such as racism, stereotyping, and exclusionary practices. And one of the most horrific examples of this from our not too distant past, in a Canadian context, for example, would be residential schools. The last residential school here closed in 1996. So you're essentially thinking about cultural genocide here. Manira?
So with cultural incapacity, in summary, it's seeing the difference, but making it wrong. And what does that mean? Cultural capacity would be the lack of capacity of systems and organizations to respond effectively to the needs, the interests, the preferences of culturally and linguistically diverse groups. So what that means is it's seeking to make the culture of others appear to be wrong. And so people and organizations or employers who demonstrate cultural incapacity have very little understanding about their own prejudices, about their own biases. And it is when you have little understanding about your own prejudices, and that's when you are more likely to believe false and unkind information about others. And in our history, we see that, and like some of the examples we can look at are, for example, looking at colonialism, looking at racial segregation, and what that means for the people impacted, and the generational impact that continues to have on them today. When we look at cultural blindness, it's essentially seeing the difference, but actually don't. And what that means is, with cultural blindness, it's where we're unable to, or we refuse to acknowledge the culture of others. So when one is culturally blind, there's discomfort in noting the differences, even if they can be perceived. So in this stage, we might hear people say, I don't see color. I think that we're all the same. I think we should all be treated the same. But the reality is that those on the receiving end, those who have less power in those relationships, they know that those statements aren't true. Everyone is seeing color. The one on the receiving end of those phrases are made to feel like their color and their culture does not matter. And while these phrases may be said with good intention, such a mindset, it minimizes all the different cultures that are associated with skin color, and that form a huge part of the identity of many. And not only that, it creates a very harmful power differential that is directly associated with the skin color gradient. One example of this that we can see in terms of how it's important to not be culturally blind is understanding within healthcare spaces. For example, clinicians or doctors, they need to know that certain racial and ethnic groups, they are more susceptible to certain diseases. And by being aware of those cultural differences, they can more proactively seek out and prevent those diseases in at-risk populations. One that most significantly comes to mind for me as being a South Asian female is that among the South Asian population, we are at much higher risk for coronary artery disease and heart disease because we genetically, we have smaller diameters of our coronary arteries when compared to other races. So these are very small, they sound insignificant, but the impact of that on the management of health within an entire community is huge.
And just to add to that as well, Manira, when you think about pain management, it's well documented when we talk about Black women and their pain, that often that is very underestimated in healthcare settings, thinking from erroneous information that Black women's bodies can handle more pain than other races. And you can just tell the kind of impact that that's had. So, small things like this are not small at all. Like Manira said, they have huge, huge impacts. And, from that caregiver healthcare relationship, it's something that, us as the individual need to know about, but then also what the healthcare setting needs to respond to as well. I do want to apologize. I have a sick infant and a sick mother at home. So if you hear things in the background, that's what's happening. So cultural pre-competence, what we're really looking at here would be you see the difference, but you respond to it inadequately. So what that means is there's a level of awareness where an organization, they note their strengths and areas for growth in relation to supporting culturally and linguistically diverse populations. So this is when the mindset starts to shift and organizations and providers are becoming more accepting of views and practices that differ from their own. There is a recognition that a change needs to be made and realize there's learning to be done. So we're speaking about this from a provider system level, but us as the individual as well, as a caregiver, what is it that I expect from the systems that I'm entering into and from the people that I'm interacting with, right? When I talk about caregiving for my parent or caregiving for my young child. What is it that I need from the system to support me? What does the system and the individuals that support that system understand? And when we say the system, individuals make up the system, right? So even when we're talking about the organization isn't some floating entity. It is people. People make up the organization and the system. So everybody, needs to be on that sort of journey of shifting mindsets. And then with cultural competence, kind of where we're coming towards is this, see the difference and understand the difference that difference makes. So in a nutshell, for example, as educators who respect diversity and are culturally competent, we have an understanding of honor their histories, cultures, languages, traditions, of caregiving, of parenting, of mothering, of being in community, right? So we value people's different capacities and abilities. We respect differences in our families' home lives. Even when you're sort of caregiving on that individual level as a family or a friend, that sort of generational bridge, for example, right? What are sort of things that I need to know about my caregiving recipient as the caregiver? What does the organization need to understand to sort of help me along that journey?
And in this continuum, the ideal pie in the sky vision of what we're aspiring to is cultural proficiency. And what that means is essentially to see the difference and to respond. And as Usha mentioned before, this journey to attaining cultural proficiency, it's ongoing. And it's a journey, it's not a destination. It invites us to reflect on our own values and our behaviors and how they can enable us to interact effectively with individuals of all backgrounds. So a culturally proficient mindset ensures that no one feels that their cultural connections are belittled or offended. And that practice, it becomes embedded into all of our interactions. So culturally proficient providers, they advocate for equitable practices. For example, within a clinic setting, it may be the use of data to better understand patient needs, or to make sure that language services and translation services are available when needed. And it might be to encourage both written and visual communication to overcome those barriers in communication. And so, what does it mean when we talk about cultural proficiency more in healthcare spaces, and specifically when we're looking at the caregiving spaces that we are in for our care recipients? It means making a commitment to lifelong learning for the purpose of being increasingly effective in serving the needs of cultural groups, and committing to regular assessments that serve as benchmarks and indicators on the road to achieving this. And this is what we look at as providers. And what this can look like, it can take the form of continuing to add on to the knowledge base within the field of cultural and linguistic competence. It can look at really looking into the communities that we're serving seeing how can we develop those new treatments, those interventions, those approaches. And this can be done by supporting and mentoring other organizations as they progress along that same continuum. So when you look at the continuum that's up here, the 3 stages on the left, they really place the blame on those that are being served. So that is essentially that the people being served, the clients, the patients, that they are the problem and they are being problematic. But as we shift towards the right side of the continuum, it causes us to reflect on our own approaches and questions whether our strategies are problematic. And so culturally proficient helps shift conversations from the left to the right side, not by placing the blame on others, but rather by acknowledging and helping to break through that negative thinking by using reflection and dialogue. And so the reality is that we may never reach the end of that spectrum. We're human. And at the end of the day, we can't fully separate ourselves from our personal cultures and our biases. However, by striving for cultural proficiency, we are committing to equitable practice. We are making a commitment to understanding the culturally driven needs of communities and adapting ourselves accordingly.
And so to really summarize, we want to leave you with this quote. It's not the end, we're continuing, but this quote for cultural competence is that developing cross-cultural attitudes allows one to develop skills for better engaging with people from all kinds of cultures. Cross-cultural skills demonstrated through the ability to communicate with respect, recognize others' values, accept knowledge, skills, and talents, and tolerate, engage, and celebrate the success of others. I would change tolerate in that quote, but it's a quote, so we will leave you with that. And as you reflect on this quote, we would love for you to sort of share your experiences if you're comfortable in the chat. But when we think about sort of cultural competence and how they play out as caregivers, my mother last year had a terrible accident, tore her rotator cuff in a really bad fall. And luckily, I say luckily because the way that she had placed her hand down in the fall, and this was outside on concrete, prevented her from having very severe head brain damage because of the way that she fell. So rotator cuff versus brain damage. And fast forward, she had to have surgery to attempt to repair. It couldn't be repaired, but it was interesting. We were in the recovery room. I was 24 weeks pregnant with a very complicated pregnancy at the time. I was on modified bed rest, but I left to go, obviously, to the surgery with my mom. And we were in recovery, and there were 2 other patients on either side. My mom was, in the middle, and the nurse is taking the vitals and all of these things. So the patients on either side of my mom, they had their sons come for the release, and the nurse got the patient out of bed, dressed them, got them ready, put them in the wheelchair, ready to leave. There were no more wheelchairs at the time, so they sent me on a mission to go find a wheelchair for my mother. And then they brought the clothes, gave them to me, and then asked me to lift and dress my mom. And I thought, in that moment, I thought it was, kind of interesting. And I had wondered about sort of the social identities that were present in this engagement, right? Why those 2 patients on either side, were dressed and prepped and taken care of, and why it fell on me, to do that for my mother. And in that moment, I had to really sort of think about and think, I was 24 weeks pregnant. It was a very complex pregnancy. I couldn't do the heavy lifting and dressing. So I did advocate for myself in that moment, but I had to, right? So when we think about that sort of cultural competence, where are we and where do we fall? as we go through this webinar, and sort of the kind of content that's being presented, I think many of us are able to sort of think about our own experiences and everything that's been happening in our own lives as a provider or as as a caregiver, or both. In Munira's case, she's a provider and a caregiver. And so when we think about sort of strategies on our journey of cultural competence, we want to look at sort of the micro individual strategies and then the macro system kind of strategies. So as a caregiver, what's important for us to know on our journey of cultural competence that we want to share with the people that we're interacting with, that are supporting us and supporting our caregiving recipient, right? What's important for people to know that is not insignificant at all. That is important to know in how those interactions are going to happen. So family traditions and dynamics. Communication preferences are big. Care providers, who speak directly to the caregiving recipient, even if there is a language barrier there, it's important to acknowledge the caregiving recipient and not just speak to the caregiver, right? Even if the caregiver is needed to maybe translate or to add context to the information. What are your values related to health and wellness, right? What gives you comfort? What do you need? What do you need to know in order to take care of? Personal space and physical contact are very important and vary by lots of ethnic and religious and racial groups. Time, how is that viewed in the client's culture? What is the importance of time? How do we navigate around that? And social customs, right? So it's not in the sense of, we're becoming experts on someone else's culture, but that we're trying to understand from their perspective and the narratives that they're giving us. And from a system perspective, what are we doing to sort of engage our cultural competence? Are we receiving training? Knowing that training in itself is not enough, that it's a commitment, it's a lifelong journey. Is there representation of people? Are you connecting with outside agencies and cultural liaisons and brokers? Our family members are a key part of the care team, because caregivers are coming with lots of information. They know their caregiving recipient the best. Do you have accessible resources, providing interpreter services? And so as the caregiver at the individual level, it's important to see how the system is supporting you. And so if you don't see these kinds of things happening on a system level, how can we, if we are in a position to, how can we advocate? How can we bring up, who can we connect with? In organizations like OCO, how can they support in sort of our navigation of cultural competence?
To wrap up, looking at the themes that we've discussed today, I've explored a little bit about our own identities and how the multiple identities that we have shape who we are, and the intersectionality between all of those identities, and how that determines where we are in that balance or imbalance of power and of power, privilege, and oppression, and how we situate ourselves in that framework. We've talked about microaggressions and bias, and how the interplay of those impacts how we view the world around us, how we interact with our environments. We have explored at length the cultural competence continuum, looking at, again, one key point to remember there is that it's not linear. It's like a wheel, in that on different days and in different situations, each of us as individuals might be at a different point in that continuum, and that just recognizing that it's a constant journey to be more on the right side of that continuum. And finally, at the end, thank you, Usha. We've talked a little bit about what strategies look like on the micro level as an individual, as a healthcare advocate, as a caregiver. What does that look like? And what do we as caregivers have a right to expect and ask for from the systems that support our loved ones and that support us? And recognizing that we have we have a lot of, it's not just about the care recipient, it's about us as the caregiver, and ensuring that those caregiving spaces are culturally safe for all members in that space. And with that, the slide deck will be shared. So we have all of our resources listed here. And now we can open it up for questions.
Thank you so much for to the both of you, really, for sharing your professional experience, but some of your profound personal experiences as well with us today, and just guiding us through those cultural proficiency, the whole journey, and sharing those helpful strategies with us today. I really love the quote that you mentioned at the beginning, Usha, is when we know better, we can do better. And your presentation has certainly been helpful towards that. So you can stop the screen sharing if you like now, and we will open it up for some questions. So as we mentioned earlier, you will receive a post-webinar email that will include the recording of today's session along with the resources, the slide deck, so you'll have all that information available to you. So here we go for some questions. We'll start us off, and please, by all means, if you have questions, you can pop them into the chat here. So here's one question. How do you respond and handle microaggressions in a healthcare setting, specifically if they are coming from the care recipient's care team?
One of the things, because I know when you're in that situation, the emotions really build up. And there's a lot of confusion of like, did that really just happen? And if you can in that moment, if you can just take a deep breath and be like, could you please repeat what it is that you said? I'm not sure that I understood what you were saying. Can you clarify what you meant by, and then name the specific microaggression that came your way, or reflect on it, and to be like, I noticed when you said X, Y, and Z, I wasn't quite sure what you had meant by that. Obviously, I can say this now in a webinar when I'm nice and calm. In that moment, understand that your feelings are very valid. I had an experience during one of my egg retrievals where I was basically like under sedation. They were like, is this your name? It's so long. We're not sure that it's yours. Like, I'm literally, my legs are in stirrups and this is happening. Luckily, somebody in the head nurse stepped in and was like, no, this is not appropriate. And after a couple of days of reflecting on it, I actually wrote to their office and sort of detailed what had happened and sort of the response. And they did get back to me. And thanked me for reflecting on that. So sometimes if you can't do it in the moment, do try and follow up. You are not being a troublemaker. You are advocating for your rights in that space. Manira?
I would just echo what Usha said. You covered it adequately. Thank you. But could I, Roxanne, could I take a moment to comment on some of the comments in the chat?
Yes, absolutely. So why don't I read them out for folks here? So one of the comments we received is, I think an important strategy would be for patients, residents, or care receivers to receive the life stories, and so a short narrative format to be a compulsory reading for any professional care or healthcare professionals. I love this.
And that's exactly, it's taken me back about 12, 13 years for my son. So as a parent, I recognize like he still has like complex developmental needs. And so it always felt like any kind of space I was walking into, he was being seen as the bundle of needs. And the best advice that was given to me was one of his teachers who said, you know what, when you come in, make sure that in your folder you have a picture of him at the front. And that to me was key, where it wasn't just the picture, it was me telling everyone in that room, like all of the decision makers, so to speak, telling them who he was as a person. What did he like? He loves blueberries. He hates eating, bananas. He doesn't like ketchup on his face. Like, being able to share those stories made him a person. a person who's not just a bundle of needs, but is a human being with likes, dislikes, favorites, and quirks and funny things. And so I think this is really, really key. Thank you, Anna, for sharing that.
Yeah, great way to demonstrate all our different identities, right? And sharing that life story. So another comment we received is, as a caregiver from a visible minority group, I constantly advocate for my elderly father's healthcare team to involve and value our input. As I often say, I have known my dad my whole life. You only have a snapshot of him. And maybe a question relating to that comment would be, what other strategies maybe we could provide to advocate for the care recipient and also for ourselves as our role as a caregiver?
So,
Go ahead,
sorry, go
Vivian.
ahead, Usha. Go ahead.
On an organizational level, it's just there is so much burden on the caregiver, the individual, the family member, the friend to constantly keep advocating and educating. We already know these situations are already high stress, and there's a lot of emotion involved. And so I think we really need to start shifting towards more of that, the provider lens, the system lens, and say what's happening in those spaces and how can we be ready for our caregivers and our care recipients? What knowledges do we need? How are we going to educate ourselves? What questions, how are we going to acknowledge the people who are coming in? There's actually a resource that's part of this webinar that has questions for providers for cultural competence, which you will be receiving, which we hope is helpful. And then I'll leave to Munira to answer the second part.
So one thing is also that working, and as Usha said, as a provider in spaces working with families who are marginalized and who have children being diagnosed with autism, often in those spaces, it can be very difficult where the provider might see themselves very much as the expert in the room. And it's often in other spaces where it's reminding the provider that while they might be the expert in their field, in what they've studied, in what they work in, the caregiver is the caregiver, whether that's the parent, whether that is whoever that is for the care recipient. They are the expert in the individual that they are representing and advocating for at that moment in time. And so there, as a caregiver, you have that right to ask for that you should be given space to be able to advocate for the person you're caring for. One piece that I look at in terms of my own personal experiences as a caregiver with both of my kids having the challenges that they did is initially when I would see these things happening, it was a learning curve for me where initially I was actually quite confrontational, where it was more like, how could you say that? And you can't really say that. But recognizing that just got providers defensive and that was not helpful or useful to my children who I was advocating for. But what was really helpful was kind of bringing it about as more of a team-based approach, saying, hey, I'm on the same team as you. We're both looking to support my children, and how can we do this in a better way? So let me tell you what works for me with my children at home, and perhaps from that you can figure out what will work on your end. So it's bringing that team, which is very hard, and as Usha said, those situations can be emotionally charged, but reminding them that bringing it back to a team-based approach is often the way to go.
Thank you so much for your answers. So one last question before we wrap up. So thank you so much for the webinar. It's really interesting, and that echoes a lot of comments that I've seen in the chat box here. The question is, what is the difference between intersectionality and identity?
So when we look at identity, we're talking about sort of the individual identities, right? For example, myself, I am a Tamil woman, I am a woman, I am straight, I'm Hindu. So all of those sort of like personal identities that belong to certain social groups. Intersectionality is that I am not just one identity, that they intersect. And depending on the space that I'm in, the way that they intersect can either cause me to have belonging into that space or experience exclusion or marginalization from that space. So for example, when I was in leadership in the school board, my colleague and I, she's a Black woman, I'm a South Asian woman, and when we're both in the same space, and our other colleague was white, often the expertise questions were directed to our white colleague, and then maybe sometimes myself, but our Black colleague was definitely silenced. So we're all women, but there's sort of that racial identity that came into play. So the way that those identities intersected, Black woman, white woman, brown woman, causes us to have different experiences within the same space.
I'm sorry, our time together is so short today. What lovely conversations. And I know we could go on for another hour, I'm sure. But we will be wrapping things up. And I want to thank you both so much for sharing your professional and personal experiences with us today. And I think I echo the comments of a lot of people who joined us for this webinar. So thank you to both of you so much.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yes, thank you so much. We could have probably gone on and on for a few hours. So thank you for taking your time to be with us.